Good morning. I'm now going to call to order this meeting of the Minneapolis Audit Committee for Tuesday, June 27th. My name is Lene Palmisano, and I'm chair of committee. We have a quorum here, so we can conduct the audit committee's business. With me today are committee member David Fisher, vice chair Scott Neal, council member John Quincy, Commissioner Liz Walensky, and council member Alondra Cano will be joining us later. So please let the record reflect that we have a quorum. Colleagues, we have a full agenda today that includes completing the performance review process for our internal auditor, receiving the Office of State Auditor compliance reports, as well as updates and reports from our internal audit department. I also want to just point out that we have the people that have been part of these audits, including members of our police department here today. So thank you for being here. May I have a motion to adopt the agenda as amended?
So moved.
It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it, and the agenda is adopted. First, we need to accept the minutes from our last meeting, which was March 21st. So I'll move adoption of those minutes. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it, and the minutes are adopted. Item number 3 on our agenda today is a summary of our audit committee's conclusions regarding the performance evaluation of our internal auditor during the closed session portion of the last meeting, which was March 21st. I'd like to move this. May I have a second?
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Does anybody have any comments? The statement that I have is before you, but does anyone have anything else they would like to add about the summary of our performance evaluation? Mr. Fisher.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I concur with the statement as written. I wanted to emphasize, I mentioned to you earlier before the meeting, that I also was impressed in discussions with Mr. Tetzel, his willingness to consider and help with the staff development of the people on his staff, helping them to grow in their positions, to be more value to the team as well as to the city of Minneapolis. And I might have emphasized that a bit more in the write-up, but I think it's implied. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think the staff in the audit department would agree with that statement too. So anything else? Okay, well, all those in favor with this statement as presented, please say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Opposed? That carries. Clerk, could I ask you to publish this summary and make it public information? Thank you. Item number 4, with that, we'll move to a report from the Office of the Minnesota State Auditor with the management and compliance reports. Here to present those findings today is Ms. Stephanie Erickson. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Chair Palmisano. Good morning, Chair Palmisano, members of the Audit Committee. My name is Stephanie Erickson, and I'm with the State Auditor's Office. I'm here to present the results of our audits, but first I'd like to thank Finance Management and the staff of the Finance Department for their cooperation and assistance during our audit. We do take some time away from their normal day-to-day duties, so I'd like to thank them for their assistance. And we audited the City of Minneapolis, the Municipal Building Commission, and the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board for the year ended December 31st, 2016. We issued our opinion on the city's and the Park Board's financial statements and issued our management and compliance reports for the city, for the Municipal Building Commission, and the Park Board. You should have received those yesterday, I believe. We performed our audit in accordance with auditing standards generally accepted in the United States. We perform it according to government auditing standards and also in conformance with uniform guidance. Our opinions on the financial statements for both the city and the Park Board were dated June 8th, 2017, and are included in the respective entities' financial report. Our opinions for both the city and the Park Board were unmodified, which is a clean opinion and the best that can be issued. This means that the financial statements are fairly presented and conform with applicable accounting standards. We also audited the city and the Park Board's federal awards and have issued our opinion on compliance for the federal programs that we audited. Our opinion on each of the city's major federal award programs was unmodified. This means that the city has complied in all material respects with the compliance requirements that were directed material to those programs. Throughout our audit, any findings that we come across related to internal control, compliance, Minnesota legal compliance, Federal program, internal control and over compliance, and federal program compliance were discussed with the respective management and staff. And at the end of our audits, we discussed these written findings in detail for each of those respective entities for both management and governance. And those were the findings that were included in our report. Our management and compliance report this year contains 2 new documents required by uniform guidance. Those are the summary schedule of prior audit findings and the corrective action plan, both of which are provided by management. The summary schedule of prior audit findings lists the findings that were reported in last year's management and compliance report and provides the status of each finding, whether it's fully corrected, partially corrected, or not corrected. The other new schedule, the corrective action plan, is management's plan for resolving our current year findings, and these were previously included in our schedule of findings and question costs. In our 2016 management and compliance report for the city, we reported 4 findings. 2 of those were new findings, and 2 of those were from the prior year. And we did resolve 4 findings from our prior year audit. One important item to note is that none of the current findings are classified as material weaknesses. The 4 that we were reported were significant deficiencies, which means that they were just important enough to bring to the attention of governance. Our schedule of findings and question costs includes the following about each finding. We include criteria, which is the basis for what we measure our finding against, the condition, what the issue is, context, which provides additional information and some perspective on it, the effect, what the condition has led to, the cause, which is reviewed with management, and then our recommendation on how to improve the issue. Our 2 new findings that we reported relate to policies and procedures. One was for internal controls over financial reporting, and one related to procurement with federal awards. The 2 findings that were repeated from last year's report were the Loan C documentation and prompt payment of invoices. In both of those prior year findings that were repeated, the city has made improvements and continues to work towards resolving those comments. The city has provided its corrective action plan for the findings reported, and as with all current year findings, we will review them again at the start of our next year's audit, and management will be required to submit another summary schedule of prior audit findings with their status provided.
Ms. Erickson, could I just ask a few questions about the slide, about the things? Can you discuss a little bit more about the new audit findings, like give some perspective on the cause or the condition?
The current audit findings relating to the internal control policies documentation or written policies and procedures. We did find through our audit that there were significant internal controls that had not been updated to reflect changes that have not, or that had been made over the past few years. So there are some changes in systems, there are some changes in service providers, and changes in different regulations. And those internal control policies had not always been updated to reflect those.
So in other words, that's just the policy and procedures document. It's not about internal controls themselves?
Well, the written policies and procedures would be the written internal controls.
Got it.
And then the other one for this year, the uniform guidance, written procurement policies and procedures. Uniform guidance is the federal requirements for federal awards, and there's specific requirements that have to be included in an entity's procurement policy or documents. And we went through and reviewed the city's procurement policies and procedures, and there were certain elements of that written, or of the uniform guidance, that were not included in their policies.
Ms. Erickson, for the past findings that now say resolved, can you explain how your office got comfortable with the fact that these issues are now resolved? Like perhaps whether controls were improved, or did you just not find an error this time in your sampling, or how does that get tested?
We do test that during our audit. We don't disclose that in our audit report. That would be something that would be discussed at meetings throughout the audit.
So how do you deem them as resolved?
Can you repeat your question?
So in this list of the 4 reported items that are now resolved, how do you decide that they're resolved? Is it based on a new test, or is it based on a internal control change or?
It depends on the finding. For the identification of federal awards, we would look at what the city reported on their schedule of expenditures of federal awards. We compare that from the beginning to the end. We look at additional information that we would have obtained during our audit of the federal award programs, the expenditures that the city provided, and compare to see if we found any additional amounts that needed to be included that weren't. If there were, then we would have an identification of federal awards issue again.
Okay, so you're saying you go back and you re-examine the sampling or the what you looked at last time, and then you also do a new look to
We would
see.
not go back to 2015. We would be looking at current year 2016 information.
Okay. All right. Any other questions? Thank you.
Great, thank you.
I'm sorry, I thought there was a whole other part of the presentation. Did you want to talk, Ms. Erickson, about the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board findings?
Sorry. We did issue our management and compliance report for the park board yesterday as well. We did have two findings for the park board that we reported. One was relating to audit adjustments, and the other was relating to the federal program that we audited, the disaster grant, public assistance, presidentially declared disasters, relating to cash management and reporting. We did resolve three findings from last year, one relating to application access, one relating to the federal program, relating to special tests and provisions, and then we also were able to resolve the prompt payment of invoices finding.
Commissioner Walensky, do you have any questions or thoughts about?
No, we realize this is coming to the park board. At that time, we'll discuss it more.
Great. Alrighty then. So I think the right motion here is I'm going to move a report from the state auditor with both of their management and compliance reports. I'm going to move to receive, file, and forward to council, knowing that the park board will take up their own with Ms. Erickson directly. That's the motion on the table. Any thoughts or questions from committee? Could I have a second to the motion? Thank you. Great. All those in favor of receiving, filing, and forwarding to council, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That carries. Thank you. Thank you, Ms.
Thank you.
Erickson. Next, we have Mr. Tetzel. We're going to start with the property and evidence room audit.
Good morning, Madam Chair, council members. So our agenda today, we'll start with the property and evidence room audit. Carol Vasiliev will present the workers' compensation audit, and then Steve McDaniel and I will go through the auditor updates. As on our 2017 audit plan, we planned a property and evidence room audit. To give a little background, I'm sure everyone is sort of informally aware of what property and evidence rooms do, but they maintain and ensure the integrity of items needed as evidence in the judicial process and reunite owners with property that's rightfully theirs. They also hold items in secure locations with additional security for high-value items such as narcotics, firearms, and cash. And they were last accredited by IAPE, which is the International Association for Property and Evidence, in 2014, and are currently going through accreditation this week. I want to make a couple notes about scoping this. There have been some audits of the property room in the past, and so we scoped out some pieces that were related to physical space adherence to the IAPE standards. It didn't make sense just to reiterate those points that haven't been addressed. They're still in the same location. It looks like the property and evidence room is scheduled to move in about a year or so to a new location. Right now they have 3 separate locations, 2 warehouses and something, and a room or a variety of rooms that are all joined together here in City Hall. The space isn't extremely conducive to running a large inventory system like the property and evidence room does, but they've been doing a really good job considering those space constraints. To put this in a little bit of perspective against other audits that we might bring to you guys, the property and evidence room is doing an incredibly good job with the amount of inventory that goes in and out of there. Because they're accredited and because they're so rigorous, these findings are probably on a lower scale of risk than you would see in other audits. There's nothing we found in here that's high risk, that's stop everything and fix this right away. If there were other findings like that, the stuff that you would see here today, except for access, would probably not even be in the report. But to be fair to Kirsten, most of this is really just opportunities for improvement. The first finding is around missing items. So we sampled and tested 113 items expected to be in inventory. 3 we could not find. 1 was found shortly thereafter. That was a firearm, so we were elated that that item was found. The other 2 were a bicycle and a bank check from the 90s. The fact that they weren't there is probably positive. I think if those items were there, the finding would be that these should have been disposed a long time ago. So we agree with Kirsten's conclusion that this is probably a records thing, that their paper documents or the system just didn't reflect the disposition that occurred probably a long time ago. Based on that, the fact that we didn't find anything else, and we did skew our sample towards high-risk items, so firearms, narcotics, cash. The fact that all of those were readily available is really positive news.
Mr. Tetzel, can I stop you there? In regarding to this finding, thank you for putting into context all of this. It's really helpful. What would be expected? I mean, are there metrics? What would we expect to be an acceptable level of missing items?
It's a good question. We benchmarked with some other property and evidence room audits, and we found some that had up to 20 to 30% of items that couldn't be located.
Wow.
And so we were kind of excited and thought this was going to be a really juicy audit, but we're a little disappointed that we didn't find some sort of glaring gaps in their processes. So I'm sure there's some that work really well and are near perfection, and I would say we're 2 items from the 90s that were very likely disposed of is pretty close to perfection, I would say.
Thank you. I'm sorry, Mr. Fisher?
Sure.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Tetzel, help me put this in perspective. How many items in inventory might the police department have on hand at any one time?
Madam Chair, Mr. Fisher, we pulled all of the data, electronic data that the property and evidence room had, and I think that was over 4 million items, if I'm right. And probably some of those have been disposed. It might be a better question for Kirsten, like at an even point, how many individual items, but there's a lot. There's a lot of stuff in there.
4 million is helpful for perspective. Thank you.
I'm seeing a nod from the audience,
No,
so we're just going
a
to
lot.
assume that 4 million is a pretty accurate figure. Thanks.
Finding number 2 is around data entries in CAPRS. So CAPRS is the police records management system. So the property and evidence room will have a paper copy of all of the inventory items that they get in, and then there will be an entry into the CAPRS system, an electronic entry that is intended to match the paper entry. We found a couple instances where there were discrepancies in the electronic system and the paper copies. That was 4 out of the 117. So we looked at 117, found 4 discrepancies. That gets you to the 113 that we were able to sample in the first finding. Again, opportunity to shore up some of those there. I think with the new system that the police department is implementing now, I doubt that they will move forward with paper copies of inventory. And so some of this should be automatically linked and might avoid any discrepancies between the 2 records that they have there.
Madam Chair, one question, if you don't
Yes,
mind.
continue.
Thank you. Mr. Tetzel, the 113 items that you mentioned, this is a sampling of the, say, 4 million items.
Mhm.
Is that correct? You didn't check all 4 million items, I'm assuming.
Madam Chair, Mr. Fisher, no.
How did you choose the sample?
We broke the population down by the inventory type. So we were able to break out firearms. We were able to break out narcotics. We were able to break out items that were held for evidentiary purposes. And so things that were low risk, like clothing or backpacks, we didn't focus as much on. We did sample from that other category that we bolt all of those into, but we tried to focus on those higher risk areas. Things that potentially tend to go missing because they're valuable outside of the property and evidence room.
And if I may follow up, Madam Chair. So the 113 is spread among the categories that are listed in your report, and they're just random, say 10 or 15 or 20 from each category? That's a question.
Correct. Yes, Madam
Okay,
Chair. Mr.
thank
Fisher,
you.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Mhm. Finding number 3, the property and evidence unit maintains a large amount of cash on hand in the cash vault. There's definitely an opportunity to get cash into the bank, deposited into the bank quicker. Cash is one of those things everywhere that people are just attracted to, that have a tendency to want to take home and use, and it disappears quickly, probably quicker than other things. And so we recommend here that the property and evidence room work with the city attorney's office in moving the approval of items, especially ones held for evidentiary purposes, to get deposited sooner into the bank, and hold a smaller cash balance in the property and evidence room. Not aiming for a dollar amount, but perhaps more for how long does something sit here before it moves into the bank.
Mr. Tetzel, why do we hold the cash? And what is the current thinking? Why do we hold the cash? Why can't we deposit it sooner?
Madam Chair, according to Kirsten, one of the reasons is that sometimes city attorneys err on the side of being conservative and would rather have that evidence there so they could produce it in court if they needed to. And so some of that is letting go of that, or getting comfortable that we might have to use a picture of this briefcase or garbage can full of cash instead of being able to show it to a jury or a judge. Part of it might be just the amount of time and coordination it takes for the prosecutors to work with the property and evidence room to go through all those items that come in to say we can release that, we don't need that, hold on to that for a little bit, we'll get back to you. So it'll just take a little bit more coordination between the two, or just the authority given to property and evidence to deal with it in a timely manner.
Thank you.
We did speak with the city attorney's office, and they agree that we should get it into the bank quicker, and didn't have any objections into trying to make this work.
So that's a follow-up that will happen between police and the city attorney's office, I assume?
Potentially.
I'm
There's
sorry,
two-
let me stop you, Mr. Fisher.
Sorry, I'm asking questions, but I'm learning. Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Ketchum, how much cash would be on hand, for instance, the city at any one time? If
I'll
you could
get
reveal that.
back to you on that.
Okay. And I'm assuming it comes from narcotic transactions or something of that nature.
Yes, I think some of it is probably money that came from illegal means that is forfeited. Some of it is if someone was arrested and they had money on them, that cash could go in. So some of it should rightfully go back to the person, even if they've been incarcerated, because it doesn't have anything to do with the reason that they came into the evidence room. Some of it might just be money that was found somewhere that a citizen with a high level of integrity brought to the police department, such as yourself, I'm sure.
Oh, well, thank you for the presumption. And when the money is deposited, is it deposited into trust accounts, or how is that handled?
Sure, Madam Chair, Mr. Fisher, it's deposited into the bank, and then for forfeited money in the past, it's gone to, I think, the police pension, MRF, like a pension account that was geared towards the police department, if I'm not mistaken, Ms. Trammell. That stopped, and so now it's in limbo. I think the city is working on figuring out where that forfeited money should go going forward.
Right. I understand forfeited money probably would go to some benefit of benefiting the city. Other deposits, though, money that isn't evidentiary in nature but is on hand, I assume is put into some kind of segregated account. Wouldn't that be appropriate?
It is in a segregated account.
Oh, all right. So it can be identified later. And okay.
And the property room has, or Kirsten herself has the ability when someone comes in, and if we have deposited their money, don't have that envelope of exact bills or coins that they had, to write them a check up to a certain amount.
Yes, you mentioned a bushel basket of money or something of that nature, somewhat unrecorded. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions, Mr. Quincy? Or sorry, Councilmember Quincy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was just obviously speaking to Ms. Trammell, the City Attorney's Office, and she indicated a couple of interesting things that you weren't able to highlight, but certainly part of the operation is that the evidence is sometimes needed for additional investigations and authorities besides the City of Minneapolis. For example, the Hennepin County Attorney's Office might need something at some time. They're being retained for federal purposes as well. So we don't have full ownership of all this kind of stuff. So whose account does it go into if it's needed for a different purpose? But also the disposition of the properties. It's other jurisdictions are involved in that decision at some point. So I thought it was just worth pointing out.
Yes, we did, Madam Chair, Quincy, correct. We did have a conversation with the property and evidence room. They do get requests for some of that cash back, and she makes sure that those are coming from valid sources before she makes sure gets a check cut to them.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. The second part of finding number 4 was the retention period for paper PI forms was not in line with the city's retention schedule. Currently, what happens in the evidence room is when they dispose of something or destroy something, they also destroy that paper form because that item is no longer here, so we don't need the paper form. But semantically, the way that our records retention works is that you need to keep that piece of paper for 6 years after it was last active, and it would have been last active when you destroyed it. So either they need to keep the forms for longer, or they can simply change their record retention. We spoke with the city clerk's office and the records management division, and they noted that it could be dealt with either way. So minor change there. Finding number 5 relates to access, one of our favorite topics. And this is one that that would be on here regardless. We keep finding access issues both physical and system access here. So we looked at key logs, we looked at badge access, and we looked at system access. And there were discrepancies in each of those categories. Kirsten does keep a key log herself, which is above and beyond what we've seen in other departments, but this is probably one of the most high-risk locations that we've looked at. So there are processes there, and it's not ignored. It's just that there are other systems and people in the city involved in terminating access that we keep running into this issue. So this finding was geared both towards the property and evidence room and to the city coordinator's office.
Thank you. We have a couple questions. First, Mr. Neal.
Mr. Tetzel, just going back to that point you just made about the access issue we've discussed previously, just to clarify, when you talk about keys and badges, are we talking about physical keys, metal keys, not key cards or key codes or keys, right? And in terms of badges, are you talking about actual badges, or is it some kind of plastic key card? Or, and the reason I'm asking is that again, we're talking about the same issue about terminated employees. There's an access point that we could be cutting off electronically or retrieving physical badges or keys from them that isn't happening. Is that what you're saying?
Madam Chair, Mr. Neal, correct. So the keys are physical keys. The badges are electronic keys,
Okay.
for lack of a better term.
Commissioner Walensky.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Tetzel, I know that the park police also use the same storage. And I was wondering, in doing this, is there a way to improve the communication between the HR and termination people at the park board and the city in this particular instance? I know we use the same payroll system, so I would think that would help. But
Madam Chair, Commissioner Walensky, we do need to figure out how to communicate. Also, the U of M police or the university police use the property and evidence room as well, and I don't think we have the same HR and payroll shared functionality there. So there are some unique circumstances here with the property and evidence room. Now, for most of those police officers, it is access into the room where they could drop stuff off or leave things in lockers overnight. So it's not them wandering around in the firearms vaults or something. It's, that they do segregate their access, but still, yeah, not having that opportunity would definitely benefit and lead to a much more controlled environment.
Mr. Tetzel, I have a question that I've asked before every time we have one of these access problems, and it's, did anyone access the system or use a badge to access the property room after being terminated or leaving employment here at the city?
Madam Chair, good question. We did not find that anyone accessed the system or physical locations with badges. With physical keys, can't tell, but we did look at badge logs, and it appeared that no terminated employees had used their badges to access those locations. So good news there, but the opportunity exists.
Thank you. Are there other questions from, is this the last finding? I have a question, and then Mr. Fisher, in regards to all of the items that we recognize are in property and evidence, and we've talked a lot about cash, but one important responsibility we hold as a city is to return these to their owners as appropriate and after investigation and after, a due amount of process and probably paperwork. Is that something that was part of this audit? And if so, what is your sense of, is that going smoothly? Are we able to return these items appropriately to their owners?
We did look at disposition and didn't find any issues with the items being returned. Mostly that there wasn't something that we didn't have that we should have had for someone.
Thank you, Mr. Fisher.
Well, I just want to say I'm dating myself significantly, I think, in saying something like this. But I remember some years ago that this unit had been under some considerable uh, criticism for the handling of evidence, including evidence that I think was soaked in some rainfalls in the basement, which is probably why the move is timely. But I want to say that I am very impressed with the audit findings here, that this has been significantly improved from those days, and I think I'm probably talking 20 years ago now, but I'm very impressed with the volume of items that are under inventory here and your findings. I find it a very impressive undertaking by the department.
Madam Chair, Mr. Fisher, thank you. We did try very hard without wasting time and resources to look at this process really critically. And we're actually told by the property and evidence room that they were impressed with how thorough we were.
Great. There's someone next to you. I'm not.
Good morning, Madam Chair and committee. My name is Mary Dunning. I'm the interim controller for the city of Minneapolis, and I just wanted to let you know that as regarding the unclaimed property in the, especially cash and the proceeds of auctioned items, we are bringing forward an ordinance to council on Friday to clear up where the money can be deposited for the city's use. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention.
Terrific. Thank you. Commissioner Walensky.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I noticed in here that we've got some time between when we're going to move to the new location, and some of the paperwork was said that we would need to work with the business office in order to fix some of it. Is there a plan or a work plan where those will kind of coincide so that when they are in the new facility, the paperwork piece of it and the tracking is also up and ready at the same time?
Madam Chair, Commissioner Walensky, I think Kirsten might be able to better address that. Right now, the city is implementing a new records management system that has a property and evidence module. So if that goes as planned, I think that implementation is scheduled for after the Super Bowl, so next spring. And the latest update I got on the new location was next summer, potentially. So those, I think a lot of the stuff should really fall in line with their new location and the new system and some of the enhancements that the property and evidence room have been waiting to make because of these two constraints, I would say, that they have.
Okay, thank you.
Would you like to add to that? Yeah, come on up.
Thank you. I'd like to welcome Kirsten. I'm sorry.
Hammerberg.
Hammerberg. Ms. Hammerberg. Thank you for being part of this audit. Did you have any comments or thoughts about it that you wanted to share at this time?
Madam Chair and committee, thank you very much. Number one, I just want to acknowledge that what's been said about our appreciation of the thoroughness of this audit is accurate. I've been here running the evidence unit for 17 years, and I've gone through a number of audits, and this was timely, it was efficient, it was just very well done. And so I'm appreciative of the audit staff for having done that, and I just want that publicly acknowledged. As far as the concern about paper records, we are on a computerized paper system right now. The new records management system that is being implemented by the police department has a component that is just for property and evidence, and the goal is to be as paperless as practical. I don't want to say that we'll be 100% paperless because I don't believe that's ever possible. However, we will have a majority electronic system, and so that should help with the documentation. It should help with the disposition of property and evidence, and it should help with a variety of concerns that were pointed out in this audit. I hope that addressed the question.
Super. Are there any other thoughts from Ms. Hammerberg? No. Thank you for being part of this. This has been an illuminating look at our property and evidence room, and it's good to hear. that it seems that we're holding things securely, documenting everything properly, and returning property as appropriate to the parties involved. So thanks so much for being here.
Thank you very much.
Madam Chair, a few things just to mention, and we'll do this as standard for each audit, but the management has agreed with our findings and implementing the responses to our recommendations. And there's also, so I think there was 14 recommendations, and one of those will be handled by the city coordinator's office, the access one. I will now turn it over to Kirill.
Great. Before Mr. Vasiliev comes up, I just wanted to say thank you. Good work. I also saw some agreement, some nodding from our city coordinator in the back of the room about the item that is a follow-up for the coordinator's office. So let me please move the Property and Evidence Unit audit from Director Tetzel here at this time. May I have a motion to receive, file, and publish this report? Thank you. It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? The ayes have it, and this motion passes. Thank you. The next item on our agenda is our workers' compensation audit, and here to present that is Mr. Kirill Vasiliev. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, Audit Committee members, my name is Kirill Vasiliev, and I'm manager at the Internal Audit Department, and I'm presenting our audit of the workers' compensation process. This audit was part of our 2017 audit plan. As some background, the workers' compensation process, it's part of what the workers' compensation process, what the workers' compensation unit does. The workers' compensation unit is a part of the risk management and claims division, which is under the city's finance and property services department. The workers' compensation unit handles all aspects of a claim when a city employee is injured. So they take in those first reports of injuries. They look at claims to make sure that whether or not the city is responsible under its policies and under workers' compensation regulations for those expenditures. They look at the individual medical bills to approve whether or not those are reasonable expenditures. They also provide support to city attorney's office when a claim maybe goes through some legal activity because there might be disputes. And they also share information with other departments and with safety staff so that we can hopefully find patterns in injuries and try and address the causes of why employees get injured rather than just paying for claims when an injury occurs. This audit scope focused on the workers' compensation unit's overall process. We didn't get into whether a specific claim was correctly approved or not correctly approved. We didn't feel we had the appropriate expertise to look at medical documents and say whether or not something was accurate. But because we were focusing on the overall process rather than individual claim, we didn't go out and take those workers' comp classes or bring in an outside resource to actually evaluate those individual claims.
We have a question from Mr. Neal.
Mr. Vasiliev, just before we get too far into the audit itself, I'm wondering if you can answer just a couple of questions about how the work comp function is organized within the budget, because I think it'll make a difference later when I ask you questions about the finance piece of it. Is it organized as an internal service fund? Is it has a standalone component to it financially?
Sure. Madam
Mr.
Chair,
Vasiliev, Ms. Dunning might also be the right person to direct that question to.
Correct when I'm wrong. Madam Chair, Mr. Neal,
Yeah.
The city is self-insured, so we have a bank account with a certain amount of money that when an employee is injured and the injury is a compensable claim, the city pays for that claim out of this pool of money.
Sure.
in terms of budgeting the expenditures for the claims, and some reimbursements related to claims are done within, for workers' comp, within the risk management group, within property and finance. For some of the claims, the city also, in addition to being self-insured, has purchased a reinsurance policy. So if a specific claim becomes extremely expensive, as some injuries can, at a certain threshold, the city actually is able to request and get reimbursements under that reinsurance policy. So there's a maximum exposure limit that the city has for certain claims. And so those reimbursements are budgeted in a other revenues bucket, and then the claims related expenditures are budgeted in expense bucket.
So it's a
Setting.
distinct self-funded fund within the city's budget. So it has a fund balance that it probably carries from one year to the next, or a deficit carries from one year to the next, right?
Mr. Neal, yes, I believe there may or may not be the tort self-insurance balance may or may not be in the same account, but they're budgeted for and funded for us separately through separate actuarial reports that show how much we need to fund them every year.
Thank you.
So for this audit, we ended up with 3 findings and some associated recommendations. The first finding is on the workers' compensation budget. When scoping this audit and reviewing key department and unit drivers and how they measure their success, one recurring theme has been that they have a budget target for their expenditures, and they know they are doing well when their expenses for claims are in line with kind of their predictions and their budgets. So if we pay excessively, we'll be over budget. If we are denying too many claims, we might be under budget. We might have some lawsuit expenditures as a result. But that budget to actual comparison was a key driver. And we also, in conversations, noted that the claims expenditures had been experiencing a sizable gap of several $1 million for multiple years, suggesting that we'd been overpaying versus where we should have been for claims-related expenditures. Because this was such a key area, we looked at it in a little bit more detail, and we noted that the budget figure was actually incorrectly determined for a couple of different reasons. It didn't include certain expenditures when we were predicting the budget, and it included certain reimbursements as a deduction to expenditures, thus reducing how much we were actually saying our expenditures should be, and ending up by default over budget every year. So because this is a little bit more complicated, I'll take a couple extra slides to explain it. But essentially our recommendation here is to revise the budget process to adjust for these inconsistencies to end up with a more viable target figure that we can use for assessing our results. So when we conduct our budgeting and actual results, in this picture, I'm representing the expenses and the reimbursements kind of in rectangles, with claims going from 2016 back in the past. So each year we'll make payments for claims, and some of those payments are for an event that occurred last year or 2 years ago, or in some permanent disability cases going back to the 60s. So when we're looking at this representation helps understand how we were budgeting. So for doing that budget to actual comparison, the workers' compensation group took that entire bucket of all the expenses in a given year for every single claim, whether it happened this year, last year, in the 60s, and used that as the actual figure, which is what we'd expect. We'd want to take the total expenditures for a given year and use that as our actual results. When we started reviewing the actuarial report, we noted that as part of their process, one of the first steps done was to take the expenditures and subtract out the receivables. That ended up with a net payment amount, which is the total amount that the city actually has going out the door after we get some reimbursements. But when we were then using that result to compare to the budgets, we're not actually comparing the same type of figure. We're always going to be over budget because that budget has subtracted out some receivables. So that was our first issue that we noted in terms of how that budget was being developed and why we were seeing a gap between our actual results and those budgeted results. As part of this analysis, we also noted that the actuarial assessment didn't actually consider all the expenditures going back to the earliest claim year. The report only looked at expenditures from 95 to present, and still did the netting and created an estimate for how much we'd pay out based on just those two buckets that are highlighted here on the screen. That's reasonable with some assumptions. If, for example, you're assuming that an older claim will be fully reimbursable because we're over a cap, then the two expenditures and reimbursements at the top are going to net to zero anyway, so that shouldn't really affect the figure. But the way we were using the end result and using the budget to actual comparison was just completely unaligned with the way that budget was being developed and the basis for the numbers that we were using here. So just kind of splitting this out so it's a little bit easier to see. When we were doing the budget to actual comparison, on the left, we were grabbing all the expenses for a claim that happened in 61 that we paid this year, all the way through the current year's claims that we paid for this year. But we were comparing that to an estimate of just the expenses for claims for 95 onward minus a reimbursable piece. So we were comparing completely different numbers when we were trying to see whether our actual results were on target. So for this example and for the walkthrough in the report, we used 2016. That was the most recent year that was complete for our analysis when we were trying to figure out the magnitude of the impact. So we were seeing 9.4 actual expenditures for 2016 when the actuary-based figure that we used in our budget was 6.8 million. So we were ending up 38% over budget just because we were not really looking at the same figures. To try and assess the impact rather than redoing the actuarial assessment and prediction and adding in additional pieces, we used our actual results and tried to get a number that should represent the same figure that's in the budget, just to get a sense of the magnitude of how big of a deal this is. So when we looked at it, we took all of our expenditures from 61 to 2016. We subtracted out the piece of expenses from 61 to 94 because the actuarial report did not include that element in their budget prediction. We then subtracted out the reimbursements from 95 to 61 because the actuarial report subtracted out that piece. So when we actually looked at a more comparable figure using our actual results to what the budget was supposed to be, we ended up with a much smaller gap of only about 6%, 400,000 versus 2.6 million. So we, going through all this, we identified that one of the key drivers that we've been talking about and one of the key drivers that we've been missing our target on for many years was just we were setting up ourselves to fail because we were using the wrong target to aim for. And as I mentioned earlier, the recommendation here is to adjust our budget setting process so that we have a figure that's more comparable to just the expenses piece as we're doing our budget versus the process that we're following right now. Any questions before I move on to finding 2?
I see a couple here. Mr. Fisher.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, Mr. Vasili, thanks for the graph. This makes it pretty clear and a clear path to understanding the issue. You're recommending that the budgeting process take account for the future going forward, take account of expenditure and then exclude reimbursements. But isn't the city's actual budget the net amount? Shouldn't the budget be budgeted towards that with an estimate for what the reimbursements would be in future years?
Madam Chair, Mr. Fisher, perhaps that's a wording issue. We budget for reimbursements and for expenses in separate categories, and we have separate categories for the actual results for the reimbursements we receive and the expenditures we put out. We do want to budget for both elements, but because we're capturing them in separate accounts and separate line items within the budget, the issue was that part of those reimbursements, we were capturing the full amount of reimbursements from 61 to present in the reimbursement piece, and then a portion of it was effectively being double counted in the budget for the expenditures because we were subtracting it out before getting to that expenditure budget. So it's more of a make sure they're in the right buckets recommendation rather than a don't budget for this.
I see. So you're not actually saying exclude the reimbursement piece, but don't double count what you have.
Essentially, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Vasiliev, can you just repeat, how long have we been budgeting this way?
Based on our review, this was first done for the 2009 budget, so 8 years.
And then what reasons, I guess, year to year, what reasons do the workers' comp team have for being over budget?
As we discussed this in the beginning, before we had a sense of the detail of the actuarial review, it sounded like the expectation was we were just paying out too much, that we had this figure of where we should be, and because we're over, and because this figure represents how much we are paying for claims, if we're over, then that means that we've paid too much.
I see. So was there an assumption that the actuary was providing inaccurate data?
Madam Chair, no, I think the assumption was the figure that we used from the actuarial report was accurate, but that our expenditures were just excessive because we were approving more claim-related expenditures than we should have been because we were relying on that actuarial figure.
Okay, thank you.
Madam Chair.
I'm sorry, one other question from Mr. Neal.
Yes, Mr. Vasiliev. So going back to the question I asked before about how this operates as an internal service fund, it's not unusual whether it's self-funded or whether you buy work comp insurance on a public or a private market to miss the mark and have operating deficits from year to year. But what's the status of the fund itself? Is it in a cash deficit condition right now, or is it run operating deficits so many years in a row that it's essentially in a deficit itself, or where do we stand there?
Madam Chair, Mr. Neal, we didn't dig in very closely into the level of funding. I believe since we were funding based on how much, so there was a separate figure that was put in from the actuarial. The actuarial report provides multiple figures. One of them is an estimate of how much cash is going to go out. One is an estimate of how much you need to put into the fund to remain funded. Because the estimate was based on the net amount of expenditures minus reimbursements, I believe we were funding it appropriately because those reimbursements were coming in in a different line item for the budget and budget to actual results, but the money was still being captured within that bank account. There might be a slight adjustment if we revise the actuarial prediction based on a more complete data set, but we just trying to go through that process and redoing the pages and pages of actuarial assessment we didn't go through that because we had a different perspective. And we have an expert who just happens to have a folder and
Okay.
may provide us more information.
Great, thank you.
Madam Chair, committee members, Mary Dunning, interim controller again. We just happen to have a copy of our 2016 CAPR. And you are right, we have a single internal service fund for all of our self-insurance, which also includes our tort liability and some other city attorney related items.
So park board, utilities, everything.
Park board is not included in
Okay.
our self-insurance fund. But just so that you know, at year end 2016, we had $80 million in the fund. And 21 million of that was unrestricted fund balance. So the fund is in very good shape.
Okay.
But we do want to get the right money in the right pots.
Okay. Very
Okay.
good. Thanks.
Thank you.
So our second of three findings relates to the staffing. So as part of reviewing how the workers' compensation process functions, we looked at how the resources were determined for what is needed to be able to accomplish the goals of the unit. We note that the workers' compensation unit currently has 2 adjusters, 1 support staff, and 1 manager. In 2016, there were 3 adjusters. There was a retirement, and there was a temporary external contractor filling in that vacancy for a little bit, but it's currently an empty slot. When we talked about what the goal was and what was needed to be able to have the workers' compensation process work efficiently and effectively, we'd had several conversations about getting another adjuster or getting another support staff and workload levels, but we didn't see any kind of specific assessment as to what was needed for our unit. We did our own research, and the end result really was all over the place, with the only consistencies being the more support staff adjusters have, the more claims they can handle, and that every single office is different because you're working with a different population. The city of Minneapolis has different workers' comp adjuster needs versus a place that doesn't have a police department or a fire department, which incurs a lot of injuries. And because we were seeing such inconsistent benchmarks for what staffing should be and could be, and because we didn't see a specific assessment for our workers' compensation unit as to what is actually needed, we have our finding and recommendation here that some sort of staffing review be done before or as we are filling in this current vacancy. We also noted that several of the current staff are not in immediate timing for retirement, but could be retiring within 5 or 10 years. And that's a lot of knowledge of how our staff, how our workers' compensation functions at the city, what departments need what kind of resources, what the employment contracts are, what Minnesota law is relating to compensation claims. So we noted that this vacancy currently might be an excellent opportunity to do succession planning, potentially bringing in a junior staff member that can be brought up on claims and fill in a more senior role when there is a need. So for this item, we are recommending that some sort of consideration for long-term planning be considered, and that an assessment be done of staffing levels and staffing needs. Part of our research, we spoke with the group that provides workers' compensation for the League of Minnesota Cities, and they mentioned that it's fairly common for a workers' compensation function to get an external review. We've had some reviews from the reinsurance group looking at our documentation, but we haven't really had an external review looking at, are we organized and set up the way we're supposed to? We did some of that, but we, again, don't have the expertise to say, you have enough people to handle the claims because we don't have the best sense of how much work needs to go into a claim, whether we should be researching more and investigating more, or whether we should be approving way fewer claims and providing more opportunities to fight legally for claims that might not be valid. So we're recommending an external review be conducted as part of this.
Thank you. A question, what were the staff numbers in the recent past?
Currently, there are 2 adjusters which do their main responsibilities to look at claim documentation and decide whether or not it is valid. There's 1 support staff that does a lot of the billing and calculation of payments, and there's a manager. Recently, last year in 2016, there were 3 adjusters and 1 retired. There's also, a few years ago, some workers' comp groups have a nurse on staff or on contract to handle and assist with extremely catastrophic claims. So they would actually go with an individual to doctor's appointments. They help analyze and assess the proper treatments with the goal of getting the best treatment for the employee that is also coverable by the city. There was such a resource on staff 3 or 4 years ago, but that had been discontinued, and I believe is now can be made available on a case-by-case basis, but isn't used nearly as much as it used to be.
Thank you. Other questions? Well, a staffing study sure seems warranted, so I'll follow up later to see if the department's planning on this and that sort of thing. So thanks. I'm sorry. 1 question. Mr. Fisher.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Considering that the budgeting process we talked about in last finding has been going on since 2009, you indicated, I would assume that the staff has been under some considerable pressure over the years for always being over budget, maybe accused at some time, I'm making this up, I don't know, but maybe accused of paying out too many claims or being too quickly to approve claims. I'm assuming that your recommendation would include in the staffing functional review that might take place, that the consideration be taken of what the actual budget issues have been over the last 7 or 8 years, and that they be corrected so that an appropriate staffing level can be determined. Because I think it's probably indicating that the department is much more efficient than that record over the last 7 or 8 years has indicated. That'd be correct.
Madam Chair, Mr. Fisher, I think yes, I agree with your statement. I would also say that we should be approving the expenditures that are necessary and approving expenditures that are not excessive. So that target of whether or not we're on budget, it shouldn't updating that target to be more realistic shouldn't change how we process claims. It may change how much pressure there is to drive the claim costs down because there's not as much need to. But in terms of whether or not we approve or disapprove something, that should be agnostic of whether or not we're over or under budget. Because if an employee is injured and is due treatment under workers' compensation regulations and employment contracts, we should be paying that treatment or we're exposing ourselves to a lawsuit. So I don't know how much the budget will do other than maybe change the direction being provided to adjusters in terms of approving expenses. I hope that made sense. Our last finding, we did review the documentation that was being maintained to support claims. The documentation is important because it shows that we followed the appropriate process. It helps protect the city in case there's a lawsuit and provide a record of what we did and why the choices were made. It's also something that is reviewed as part of the reinsurance policy and helps us get reimbursements for those catastrophic claims, which are excessively expensive. We did notice some discrepancies in some of the documentation that was being maintained. And for our recommendation, we do know that there has been an ongoing process to review claims and shore up the level of documentation that is in place right now. We would recommend continuing that process because it looks like it has improved the level of documentation. We would also recommend considering improving that review process with some peer reviews, which would help provide the adjusters a reason to discuss their own best practices in terms of how to document something more easily or more efficiently. It can also give them the opportunity to ensure that a similar claim in different departments handled by different adjusters has a similar outcome if they're able to periodically review each other's work and have that expert opinion on whether or not they would have made the same call on a certain expense.
Thank you. Can you help us put these discrepancies into perspective based on the amount of work that goes into each claim?
Madam Chair, the discrepancies primarily seem to be the documents weren't there yet. We didn't find a bill that was paid without an invoice. It was more along the lines of something maybe not being scanned in or readily available yet, or notes or plans for resolving a claim not being updated yet. So that's the magnitude of the discrepancies. For the adjusters, there's a lot of work that goes into managing a claim, from getting an initial injury report, deciding whether or not the city is liable for the expenses, processing that report, contacting individuals, reviewing bills, scanning documentation, reviewing mail, setting up some billing, working on return to work. So there's a significant number of steps that the adjusters currently do that, from our research and staffing, was a task that in some cases adjusters did, or in some cases were delegated out to support staff, and the adjusters focused just on looking at documentation and deciding whether or not it was okay, even to the point of the initial intake of a claim being done by data entry individuals rather than adjusters. So there's a lot of effort and a lot of work that our adjusters do, and it's possible that a work staffing study would look at it and say, here's how to adjust your process to better document as you're going along. Or it might say, based on the workloads, we're asking you to do 2 people's work instead of a single person's work. We don't have a set sense, but we have a sense that things aren't necessarily exactly set up, whether it's an internal individual process that needs tweaking or the overall staffing levels that need tweaking. There's some opportunities for both.
Thank you. Commissioner Walensky?
Thank you, Chair Palmisano. Mr. Vasiliev, with this and being able to have better documentation and better record keeping, would this help in the sharing information with the departments to improve the safety and, in theory, prevent more claims? I can give you an example with the park board where we found all of our foresters were having shoulder injuries, and it was because of the wood chippers. They kept throwing things back at them. And when we dropped the wood chipping process with our new internal process for doing the trees, that dropped the claims considerably. So is there a purpose beyond that, so that not only will you have better record keeping going forward and better claims, but also then being able to report back? I mean, we have park police, but we don't have like a fire department. So, I mean, would there be a way there that they'd be better informed to maybe change training or policies within to then reduce these needs for claims to begin with.
Madam Chair, Commissioner Lewinsky, there's some opportunity there. I think the biggest opportunity is there's a software system that was put in place 2 or 3 years ago called Riskmaster that is working to manage the claims, and that's where a lot of the current documentation and notes and claims plans are being documented as a system of record. We definitely noted that there might be opportunities to expand the use of that system, whether it be as part of keeping better documentation or looking at work efficiencies and how things should be staffed better. That system can track these kinds of data points and be more easy to share and analyze the full data set and look for who's had shoulder injuries next to wood chippers, for example. The current process involves more of a manual communication from the adjusters when they receive a more catastrophic claim or might be seeing a pattern to the safety personnel saying, hey, this is a big deal, you should look at this type of claim, or hey, we've seen a number of folks getting shoulder injuries, you should look at it. So there might be some opportunity to get that data more automated or get a more complete data picture as we're looking at improving documentation.
Thank you.
So in conclusion, we did have agreement with the findings in the report, and the risk management group does plan to take actions to address the findings.
Great. Well, we want our people to be well and have all they need to recover, and we also want to budget smart and appropriately. So I think we can all agree that this has been a useful audit. Thank you for your work. May I have a motion to receive and publish this this report?
So moved.
It's been moved and seconded. All those are there any other questions about it? First of all, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That carries. The next item on our agenda is the internal audit report. And I think, Mr. Tetzel, are you here to give the auditor update?
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
3 items on the auditor update. I wanted to talk about some report enhancements that we hope you noticed. We'll go through all the audit findings, follow-up, and then I will give you an overview of our progress on the 2017 audit plan. So in our report, I think we strive for a very succinct way to message the overall theme of the audit. And so on the cover page of both reports, we put like a 2 to 3 sentence blurb so that if someone wasn't interested or didn't have the time to read through the whole report, they could get a general sense and then determine whether or not they were compelled to move forward. So continue to look for those. We hope it draws attention into the work that we're doing, or helps people determine that they're satisfied and they don't need to go any further. So the next is after the table of contents, we're putting in a summary of the findings. So again, to know the specific issues and our recommendations, you don't need to drill down into that report. We're playing around a little bit with some of the contents here. We've also moved scope and objectives to the end. We put those in there to help put the findings into context, but not everyone needs that context. So we're really trying to help the reader most effectively use our reports and get the information they need and then be done with it. Our reports, I think, are rather succinct, but we'll continue to try to pull extraneous information out of there to make them easier for you guys to digest, but to make them more universally easier to read and get through. So continue to see adjustments there. If you're dissatisfied with anything, let us know, but we'll tell you what we're up to in that regard. I'm going to turn it over to Stephen McDaniel to walk through the remediation of audit findings, and then I'll be back to talk about the audit plan.
Thank you, Mr. McDaniel.
Madam Chair, Audit Committee, my name is Steve McDaniel, and I am here to present the audit remediations. To begin, the State Auditor's Office presented the 2016 Comprehensive Annual Financial Report for both the city and the Park Board previously today. Just to give you a little reminder of what the Internal Audit Department does as it relates to the State Auditor findings. We've been instructed to meet with management about quarterly to go over progress on where those findings stand. And we provided the audit committee with a status update, and that's what we'll continue to do. The next status update on the 2016 findings will be in September then. There are a couple of findings from both the city's report and the Park and Rec Board's report that had findings from that were previously reported last year that are still not resolved. So those ones will get more attention, and we'll provide a status update on those findings. One in particular that we will, normally we do not validate the state auditor's findings, but one in particular is the network and system access termination finding that was resolved. It was a finding since 2014. And we do have a meeting with the state auditor's office later today to discuss testing that was done for that finding, because as you've seen in some of our audit reports, we do have access findings. It's something that we always look into scoping into our audits, and whenever there's an access finding, we bring it to your attention then. So I think there's been about 7 or so access findings that we've seen in our reports that have been issued over the past few years. And so it's something that we want to get a better understanding of what kind of testing is done from the state auditor's perspective, and we can report that back to you then. Same with the Park and Rec Board's audit report that was previously presented. There's, I believe, 4 findings. 2 of them were stated last year then as well, that we will provide you guys with a status update at the next audit committee meeting. I'll touch on a few of the, so here we are with the internal audit reports that have been presented over the past few years. And a few of these I'll dive into a little bit further. Some of the due dates remain the same, and progress is being made, and they should be implemented. The remediation should be implemented based on the due dates that were provided. If there are any times where the due dates do change, we will provide an update on that to the audit committee as well. A couple to touch on would be the construction contract review from 2013. There is one remediation that is still open. We met with the management involved with the construction contract review finding. There are new policies and procedures that have been implemented. There's a checklist that has been implemented as well. And we went in and tested some contracts that were closed out in 2016. And the required form for one of those contracts was not provided to us. They did not do one of the required forms. So we have not been able to close out the remediation that is related to the construction contract review. We will continue to meet with management and go over the issue as it relates to that, and hopefully the next time around we can validate that finding then. Another one to look at is the records management audit addendum. There's 3 open remediations currently. 2 of those were, according to management, implemented during the March committee meeting. We tested those this time around, and we found out that they were not fully implemented then. To give you a little information regarding them, there's a workflow procedure that HR has implemented. Well, it has some components that are good and improvements over the past. It does relate to access then as well, where once an employee is offboarded, they do have emails that are sent out to that individual supervisor, to their HR generalists, and to a few other people. Property services is not included in that workflow, and that could help out with the access termination issue then, as long as property services is included in that. And some of that we have talked to HR about then, and hopefully that can be implemented the next time we provide an update. Another one relates to training related to the records management audit addendum, and training has been provided for new supervisors and new managers. What the finding related to is the existing managers have not had this training then, and it's something that over the next year or so, hopefully there's a training for the current managers, which the finding mostly related to as far as terminating employees, and they've not gone through any new training then. It's something that we've brought up to HR then as well, and we'll report back to you on where that stands then as well. The HR file maintenance and retention audit, we did close out 2 remediations since the last audit committee meeting.
There were 3 other remediations that they told us were implemented over the past few months. We've met with them and wanted information that we could then validate those 3 remediations. We did not receive that information until Friday as well as today, and we have not had time to validate those 3 remediations. So the next time around when we meet at the next audit committee, we will review the information that was just received, and we can either validate that or let the audit committee know where information is additionally needed for those 3 remediations. And the last one to bring to your attention is the MPD third-party audit. This was presented in the January audit committee meeting, and they felt like there were 2 items that were implemented at the March committee meeting. When we went to ask for the information to validate those 2 remediations, they are still not quite completed. Progress is being made, but we cannot close out those findings then. It relates to a new contract, which involves the RFP process, which they are very close to having the RFP completed. And then once there's a contract in place, there's some contract language that needs to be added to close out some of those remediations. And the last 2, we do have separate slides for the Park and Rec Board then as well, and there's 2 audits that are out there. I believe there will be some more, whether it's this year, obviously in the future then too. And progress is being made on those. There was nothing that was due this time around then. So for the next audit committee meeting, we should have some of those remediations, at least have some kind of information that we can potentially validate and close out those remediations then as well. That is everything I have for the follow-up and the remediation, but if there are any questions, I can answer those.
Thank you, Mr. McDaniel. Any questions? Great. May I have a motion to receive, file, and publish this report? Thank you. All those in favor of this motion, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? The ayes have it, and this motion passes. Next, does anyone have any announcements? Great. With that, we've completed all the items on our agenda today. So seeing...
Madam Chair, no,
Oh,
almost.
oh, I'm sorry.
If I
Mr.
may,
Tetzel. Yes.
I'll update you on our progress so far this year. You know about the property and evidence and workers' comp audits because they were presented today. In progress, we have the police records management system implementation, IT third-party audits, the off-street parking audit, and the payroll audit that are underway, and then remaining audits on the plate. The first one is the third-party audit that we've been talking about so far this year. We've decided to audit Minneapolis there. Next in line, the city attorney's office has asked us to do an audit of Diversion Solutions, which is a company that helps people with suspended driver's license get up to date on their fines and get their licenses renewed. There was a Star Trib article there, and so they would like some validation on whether or not that is working as effectively as we think it is. We will start to kick off the readiness assessment for the body cameras. That's a biannual requirement through legislation. So we did the same thing for license plate reader, but going in and ensuring that there's nothing that we need to shore up or drastically improve before we are required to conduct those audits. And lastly, automatic license plate reader audit. And in this arrangement, we're working with the Hennepin County to audit each other's license plate reader programs and are going through a memorandum of understanding now. So that will flesh out later this year. So we are, I feel like we're in a good position and don't see any hurdles or anything that will get in the way of us substantially completing the audit plan this year.
Great. Thank you. This is an aggressive plan. I'm glad you feel equipped to finish this work. Thoughts? And my apologies that this wasn't fully done, your updates. I saw this slide yesterday, not in front of me this morning. So with that, all in favor of receiving the auditor's update, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? That motion carries. So now we have completed all the items on our agenda, and Seeing no further business to be presented, this meeting is adjourned.
Thanks for your email.